Good evening. Those who have watched or read Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice may recall that one of the protagonists, the lovely Portia, whose hand must be won by him who solves the riddle, says, "The lottery of my destiny bars me the right of voluntary choosing." And we can perhaps say that the same thing, when history is concerned, applies to nations. The historic event we will deal with in this episode is the Shays Rebellion that occurred in the years 1785-1787, well after the conclusion of the War of Independence in 1781. As rebellions go, it was minor. In fact, few people know about it even in the United States. But the Shays Rebellion was important for, as documented by historian Francis Adams, who was son of the President John Quincy Adams, it was an episode second in importance to none, one of the chief impelling and contributory causes to the framing and adoption of the Constitution. Daniel Shay was a hired farmhand who fought in the War of Independence, and in the Battle of Bunker Hill of April 1775 was commended for bravery and promoted to sergeant. His father, Patrick, had emigrated from Ireland as an indentured servant, and on arrival in Massachusetts was sold in an auction and worked without pay until his labor had earned back the auction price. Patrick married an Irish girl in 1747, and Daniel was born afterwards. His education, the family being poor, ended with the 3 R's: reading, writing, and reckoning, as arithmetic was called at the time. When Daniel was able to work, he hired himself out as a farmer, then moved to Brookfield, where he married Abigail, daughter of Brookfield's leading citizen. Farming was hard work at the time. A farmer did well if he could support his family with what he produced, selling the surplus and the wooden utensils that he could make during the winter. Daniel was ambitious, believed that farmers were essential to society and yet neglected. What would be liberty from England, he used to discuss in the taverns, if the merchants on the seacoast dominated the state's legislature, known at the time as the General Court. In fact, by 1776, Shay was a lieutenant in the Revolutionary Army. He was wounded and carried a scar on his cheek for the rest of his life. He was a successful soldier, though his finances did not do too well, and in February 1779 his wife wrote to him saying that she had to borrow $400 from his friend, the tavern keeper in Pelham, Massachusetts. Soldiers of the Revolution were in dire financial straits. The Continental Congress did not pay the soldiers regularly, and when they did, the pay was in paper dollars, and the dollar in those days was worth about 25 cents and rapidly going down in value. It would cost a year of a captain's pay to buy a pair of shoes, or for that matter, a good meal. The $20 bill issued by the Continental Congress in 1775 was practically worthless. It wasn't accepted as payment for debt or taxes. However, on May 10, 1780, the ubiquitous and famous Marquis de Lafayette, who had helped the Americans since 1777, came to Morristown, New Jersey, and brought with him several handsome French swords, which he gave to distinguished American Army officers. One of the swords went to Captain Shays for his bravery, efficiency, and thoughtful treatment of his men, which was good for Shay's pride, though not for his finances. He had actually to sell the sword, and the army morale was low, to be euphemistic, and Shay himself returned to Brookfield in 1780, when one more crisis over officers' pay caused many mutinies. On October 25, 1780, the wealthy John Hancock of Boston became the first governor of Massachusetts under the new state constitution. And these new instruments of government called for 2 chambers, to which people who had sufficient property to qualify could elect representatives. Inevitably, The poor farmers of the interior had little influence on political matters, whereas the rich merchants on the seacoast had all the influence. Ironically, and this is repeated often in history, it was Shays' perception that rich men had stayed in fancy houses away from the war, while the starving or freezing soldiers had a different view of liberty than the liberty the soldiers had been fighting for. That is, the soldiers had won independence for the benefit of the merchants. Now, Shays moved to Pelham, where his friend, the local tavern keeper, lived. He lived there and settled on a small farm now covered by the Quabbin Reservoir. In Pelham, Shays was considered a gentleman, and there was great distress in the farming areas of western Massachusetts. It was due to the taxes levied by the legislation to pay for the interests on the debt incurred during the War for Independence, which should provide material for meditation given the comparable trillion-dollar costs of the American wars conducted in the Middle East on behalf of Israel. The taxes had to be paid in hard money, that is, actual coin, of which there was very little, and the farmers had the least cash of all, as you can expect. There were also the debts that almost every Western farmer owed to merchants to buy what they could not produce themselves. And the Eastern merchants were as much in the loan business as in trade. They had seen to it that no law obliged them to accept paper money or goods in payment of a debt. If the claim could not be satisfied, the debtor could be sentenced to jail, and his creditor paid the cost of his board there until the debt was paid by family or by friends. The jails were crowded, poorly ventilated, and filthy. Insolvent farmers were confined with thieves and murderers, and debtors could not get bail. During various angry town meetings, petitions were drafted for the General Court in Boston to suspend the court judgment on debtors until more hard money would become available. Also, they asked to make personal property a legal satisfaction claim or to issue paper money and make it legally acceptable for payment of debts and taxes. The situation was bad for everyone, and here is a facsimile of a letter sent by Daniel Shay to a grocer. Spelling was not his strength, as you can see, but here is what the note said, transcribed exactly as the original. Mr. Hunt, please to let Mr. Conkey have 1/4 pound of sugar and charge the account to me, and you will oblige your humble servant Daniel Shays. By October 1781, the War of Independence was over, but the returning veterans felt cheated. They had fought for liberty only to give their creditors the right to drive them into courts that were sending them in turn to jail. In their disillusionment with the system of government set up during their absence, the veterans revived the English institution of the Country Convention. This was made up of delegates from various town meetings within the county, and it served as a kind of an outlet for the veterans' feelings and expression of their rights. The new government had made the County Convention obsolete. However, the first resurrected County Convention occurred in Hadley in February 1782. Daniel Shay was a delegate from his town, Pelham, and the Hadley Convention asked the General Court to restore paper money as a legal tender and to accept work on roads as payment for taxes. But the resolution got no response, and the actual first inspirer of the rebellion was not Daniel Shay, but a preacher by the name of Samuel Ely. He blasted the merchants who controlled the general courts. He blasted the Massachusetts Constitution, and he said, "I have in my pocket the Constitution that the angel Gabriel could not find fault with." Now, in April 1782, Ely addressed the farmers in Northampton, Massachusetts, and they should bind together and prevent the judges from holding court and condemning thereby more debtors. By the way, closing the courts had been a means of protecting the rebellious colonists from the recriminations by the British during the War of Independence. Ely and his friends attempted to close the courts in Springfield, but the judges put him in jail. However, some of Ely's friends were able to liberate him, and he escaped and disappeared in Vermont, which at the time was an independent republic. More people's conventions were established, more petitions were sent to the courts, but to no avail. Then in 1784, the General Court in Boston raised taxes again. But in the meantime, John Hancock resigned as governor of Massachusetts, allegedly for health reasons, but the real reasons, however, was that he was frightened by the desperate economic conditions, by the impatience of the creditors, and by the anger of the impoverished people. In May 1785, after a bitter election campaign, the reactionary Senate voted James Bowdoin into the governorship, and he was, of course, the candidate of the mercantile interests. The new legislature took a measure which can be called interesting. It voted to redeem at face value the certificates with which the veterans had been paid for during their war service. And the new tax was levied to raise sufficient revenue to accomplish this redemption, this task. However, to raise the cash to pay previous taxes, most of the Western Massachusetts veterans had sold their certificate at a large discount. And now they were to be taxed to enrich the Eastern merchants who had bought the certificates on the cheap but now had been redeemed at face value. A professional economist, we could say, would find in these historical economic events echoes of what had happened in 2008 with the housing bubble crisis. The new measures taken by the central government caused a deflation. As a consequence, wholesale prices fell dramatically, and the farmers' produce was of no more value to them, as they used to say, than stones in the fields. They pleaded with the General Court to issue paper money, but the merchants rejected the measure. At this point, Captain Daniel Shea attended several conventions, and in February 1784 he had been called before the court for the enforcement of a promissory note for $60. Shea did not appear, but at another convention that he attended, he still stated to be opposed to violent action. But in Springfield, another veteran captain, Luke Day, was less moderate. He had spent some time in jail before he escaped and went home. That humiliating experience had changed his loyalties, and he found in the Bible a passage that seemed to describe the situation of the times. Behold the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter, and on the side of the oppressor there was power. The bottom line is that he assembled about 400 men, and they entered Northampton armed with swords, muskets, and clubs. It was the day when the judges, wearing their wigs, were to open the court. Captain Luke Day's men, with bayonet affixed to their musket, surrounded the courthouse. And on the step of the courthouse, Luke Day stated that it was inconvenient to the people for the court to sit, and he entreated the honorable judges to adjourn until new conditions might be granted by the General Court, which meant the government in Boston. In the meantime, the number of armed farmers increased, and the judges, still sitting in a tavern, instructed the sheriff to tell the crowd that the courts were adjourned sine die. The sheriff translated the Latin for the mob as follows: "The judges have not renamed the day on which they will hold court again." The new governor, Bowdoin, was dismayed by the news of the disorders in Northampton, and he also did not realize that the militia in the Hampshire County was unlikely to fire upon their neighbors and maybe their brothers. The militia was generally more independent-minded than regular troops. Now you may ask, when does Daniel Shea come into all this? After the confrontation in Northampton, there were others in various other towns where the courts were to be in session to put the debtors in jail, and the situation affected all the farmers in Massachusetts. For example, in Groton, 1 out of every 4 men was sued for debt. In the same place, Groton, the leader of the complainant was a name called Job Shattuck, who had fought in the French War, the Indian War, and the War of Independence. These Groton revolutionaries stuck sprigs of hemlock in their hats. It was the emblem of Luke Day, the Bible-inspired insurrectionary leader. In Concord, Massachusetts, the local sheriff said that he was helpless against the farmers because most of the militia was among them. And on September 12, 1786, the judges arrived in Great Barrington to hold court. But about 800 farmers were there, calling for the militia to stand with them, meaning the farmers and not the judges. At this point, Chief Justice by the name of William Whiting showed sympathy for the rebels, and in his house the rebels asked and obtained that the court would not sit until the legislation of the state would reconvene in Boston. After this, the crowd broke into the jail and freed all the debtors that were there. Now, similar revolts occurred in other states, except Rhode Island, where the legislature had accepted the farmers' request to issue paper money and force the merchants to accept it in payment for debts. Back in Massachusetts, Governor Bowdoin called in the General Court in an emergency session to indict the men who had prevented the opening of the other courts earlier on. But the men in Hampshire County believed that they had acted no more criminally than the Patriots at Lexington in 1775, where the initial skirmishes between British regular and American provincials marked the beginning of the American Revolution. Anyway, all these local incidents where farmers prevented the local courts to sit and indict more debtors had shown the farmers, most of whom had fought in the actual revolution, had shown them that the leader was essential. There was Luke Day, the Bible-quoting man. He was a good speaker and planner, but they distrusted him as being too emotional. And eventually the choices narrowed down until they decided to choose Captain Daniel Shays. Men liked him for he was a respected revolutionary veteran. Shays did not want his responsibility, but the men insisted. And perhaps against his better judgment, he consented to lead his fellow farmers against oppression and to stop the court at Springfield, even though he knew that by doing this he would be committing treason. That same year, 1786, the command of the Hampshire County Militia was given to Major General William Shepherd. He too had fought in the Revolution, but was on the side of government, or as we say otherwise, the side of law and order. General Shepherd had little military equipment and persuaded the Massachusetts Secretary of War to give him the keys to the arsenal. And he also armed 200 volunteers on the Tuesday morning of September 20, 1786. Daniel Shay also rode into Springfield at the head of 700 men, only a fourth of which, however, had any weapons other than their wooden clubs. Respectfully, Captain Shay saluted General Shepherd and asked permission for his men to parade. The general agreed, given that most farmers were wearing the Continental Army uniforms of the war. The parade over, Shays and his men issued a petition to the judges asking that no cases be heard without the consent of both parties. And it also stipulated that the farmers would not be taxed for the cost of the militia arrayed against them. The judges replied in legalese, saying that they could not do anything inconsistent with the important duties of their body. The situation was getting tense, and there was fear that Shay's men would also attack the arsenal and acquire arms. In the meantime, in Boston, Governor Bowdoin said that what the rebels needed was punishment, and the Senate passed the Riot Act, which provided punishment for all gatherings that did not disperse within 1 hour after the sheriff had read the Riot Act to them. Their property was to be confiscated, they were to be given public whippings, to be imprisoned for 1 year, during which time they were going to be whipped every 3 months. The Senate also suspended the habeas corpus, that is, man's basic right in a free society to safeguard a person from illegal confinement, which brings to mind the notorious and very questionable and recent Patriot Act. The situation was getting tense. 160 government armed horsemen started hunting leaders, eventually capturing one of them, called Job Shattuck, a hero of the Revolutionary War. Shattuck in this event was wounded, beaten, and treated very cruelly in jail. This galvanized the loyalties of the insurgents towards one another, and every man realized that now they were all in danger. Daniel Shay sent out a letter calling for a meeting of the leaders and said, "The seeds of war are now sown. I request you and every man to supply men and provisions to relieve us with a reinforcement. We are determined to carry our point. Our cause is yours. Do not rest, and let others die here, for we are all brethren." On Sunday, December 3, 1786, Shays arrived with 350 men to Worcester and billeted them with the inhabitants of the town. By Monday afternoon, the numbers of insurgents rose to about 1,000, but then snow began to fall, the roads were blocked, and no more reinforcement could get through. They were all too poor to buy food or pay for shelter, and Shays maintained order and discipline, but he did not have the personality to rally their spirits as George Washington had done in similar condition at Valley Forge during the War of Independence. They were too few, too ill-equipped, and too tired to reach Boston. So they decided to petition the legislature for the restoration of the habeas corpus, the release of Job Shattuck, and the complete pardon and safety for all who had taken arms. At this point, Governor Bowdoin went to the merchants to raise the money necessary to form an army of 4,000 people, 4,000 men. The headquarters for the army was to be Roxbury, and the army was to be financed for 30 days. Heading what we can call without hesitation this mercenary army was General Benjamin Lincoln. He had been a remarkably unsuccessful general during the War of the Revolution, but enjoyed the friendship of George Washington, and as we know, the power of contacts overpowers any other. As it may be expected, Shay's petition was rejected, but now the rebels knew that they had to fight or be forced into an unconditional surrender and an infamous punishment. Luke Day, the Bible-inspired leader, addressed his small contingent as follows: "My boys, you're going to fight for liberty. If you wish to know what liberty is, I will tell you. It is for every man not to serve the devil." Now, as it often happens in military operations, something went wrong. The idea of the rebels was to attack the arsenal in Springfield and to get arms, but there was confusion in communications, and in the meantime the army of General Lincoln arrived. Most of the rebels panicked and deserted. The government put a price on the heads of the rebels, $750 for Shay, $500 for Luke Day, and a few others. Privates were granted pardon if they took the oath of allegiance and would be banned for 3 years from public offices, and this was to prevent the rebels to get, by means of legislation, what they were losing by insurrection. Daniel Shays, after some rocambolesque escapes, fled into Vermont. The last skirmish of the rebellion happened between South Egremont and Sheffield. 2 rebels were killed, 50 taken prisoners. This marker on the spot of the conflict is a reminder of the last battle of the Shays' rebellion. 14 rebels were convicted of treason and condemned to hang, but on April 26, 1786, Governor Bowdoin retired, John Hancock returned as governor, and the death sentences were commuted at the last moment. As for Shays, he stayed in Vermont for 8 years. Then a friend of his, with whom he had fought in the Revolution for Independence, became a judge in the new Schoharie County in New York State. Then Shay moved to New York State and eventually settled as a squatter on government land near the hamlet of Hungersford in 1814. He was still respected by the county folks, and was pleased that they called him General. However, as I said at the beginning, the Shays' Rebellion was the major element that decided two important issues. One was the centralization and federalization of government, and the other was the loss of independence of the original colonies that had fought the War of American Independence. Furthermore, the Shays' Rebellion had divided Massachusetts and other independent colonies into a creditor and a debtor class. The creditors throughout the country were now determined to guard their property against further attacks, which, as we said, was one of the chief impelling and contributory causes to the framing and the adoption of the American Constitution. It could also be argued that this centralization of the independent states sowed the seeds of the Civil War, or the War for Southern Independence, that would take place in the next century. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I am Jimmy Moglia for Historical Sketches. Good night.